Barbara stared out of the kitchen window, the autumn leaves dancing in the wind, reflecting the turmoil in her mind. It had been 4 years since she married Jimmy, a man 35 years her junior. Their love story was unconventional, but it was real, rooted in a deep connection formed when they met as sophomores, Jimmy a college senior, Barbara a non-traditional student returning to finish her degree. Jimmy's kindness and loving nature had captivated her, and after 5 years together, they had tied the knot in a small ceremony, surrounded by family and friends. Their marriage was strong, built on mutual respect and understanding. But now, that bond was being tested in ways Barbara could never have anticipated. The source of the strain was Jimmy's younger brother, Brent, whose presence in their home was quickly unraveling the peace Barbara and Jimmy had worked so hard to build. To understand the current situation, Barbara reflected on the history that had shaped Jimmy and Brent's relationship. The brothers had lost their parents in a tragic car accident when Jimmy was 18 and Brent was only 12. The loss had devastated them both, but Brent, being so young, had been particularly traumatized. With no other family to turn to, Jimmy had stepped up, putting his own life on hold to raise Brent. He worked multiple jobs to pay for his college degree while also caring for his brother. This sacrifice had strengthened their bond, but it had also created a complicated dynamic. Jimmy often neglected his own needs and desires to support Brent, who struggled with independence and decision-making. Throughout his 20s, Brent had drifted from one job to another, never quite finding his footing. Jimmy was always there to help, whether it was lending money or using his connections to find Brent new opportunities. Barbara had watched this pattern play out over the years, concerned but supportive, knowing how much Brent meant to Jimmy. But things had taken a turn for the worse 6 months ago when Brent's wife, Lisa, started seeing someone else. The divorce that followed was bitter, leaving Brent devastated. He fell into a deep depression, began drinking heavily, and eventually lost his accounting job due to his frequent absences and mistakes. At first, Barbara felt sympathy for Brent. She listened to his late-night rants, encouraged him to seek therapy, and tried to be a good sister-in-law. But as the months dragged on, it became clear that Brent was not interested in helping himself. One night, just a month ago, Brent showed up at Barbara and Jimmy's doorstep, drunk and desperate. He admitted he was in over his head and begged to stay with them until he could get back on his feet. Without consulting Barbara, Jimmy immediately agreed. Barbara was stunned but kept her feelings to herself. She trusted Jimmy, even though she had serious reservations about how this would affect their lives. That night, after Brent had passed out on their couch, Barbara tried to talk to Jimmy. She suggested setting some ground rules and a timeline for Brent's stay, but Jimmy brushed her concerns aside. He insisted that Brent needed their help and that this was just a temporary situation. But weeks turned into a month, and Brent showed no signs of improving. He slept until noon, left his messes for Barbara to clean, and ate their food without ever offering to help. He spent his days playing video games and watching TV, and worst of all, he had taken over Barbara's home office. As a remote graphic designer, Barbara needed that space to work, but Brent claimed he needed it to look for jobs, though he never actually applied for anything. His constant presence was driving Barbara to the brink, and her work was suffering because of it. Barbara's patience was wearing thin. She tried talking to Brent, encouraging him to clean up after himself and to take his job search seriously, but he always had an excuse. When she brought it up to Jimmy, he defended Brent, insisting they needed to be patient because Brent was going through a tough time. Barbara felt trapped. She loved Jimmy, but his unwavering loyalty to Brent was starting to feel like a betrayal. It was as if her needs didn't matter, as if Brent's problems were more important than their marriage. The tension in the house was palpable, and Barbara knew something had to give. The breaking point came last week. Barbara had a critical deadline for a major project, one that could make or break her career. She had been up all night working, trying to finish, when Brent barged into her office, demanding that she let him use the computer. He claimed he needed to send an important email, but Barbara knew better. He just wanted to check his fantasy football league. "Brent, I'm working," Barbara said, trying to keep her voice steady. "So what? I just need it for a few minutes," Brent replied, not even bothering to look up from his phone. "No, Brent. I have a deadline. You can use the computer later." Brent rolled his eyes and muttered something under his breath. But Barbara stood her ground. She was exhausted, stressed, and out of patience. When Brent finally left the room, she broke down in tears. Later that evening, after Brent had gone to bed, Barbara confronted Jimmy. She poured out her frustrations, telling him how Brent's presence was destroying their home life and her career. She had tried to be supportive, but it was clear that Brent had no intention of changing, and she couldn't take it anymore. "Jimmy, I love you, but this can't go on. Brent is taking advantage of us, and it's not fair. I'm losing my mind here," Barbara pleaded. Jimmy listened quietly, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. He loved Barbara, but Brent was his brother, his responsibility. He had promised their parents he would take care of Brent, and he didn't know how to balance that promise with his marriage. "Barbara, I get it, I really do. But Brent is my brother. He's been through so much and I can't just throw him out," Jimmy said, his voice heavy with guilt. Barbara felt her heart break a little more. "I'm not asking you to throw him out, Jimmy. I'm asking you to set boundaries. We can't keep enabling him. He needs help, real help, and we can't be the ones to give it to him anymore." Jimmy sighed, running a hand through his hair. He knew Barbara was right, but the thought of abandoning Brent, of failing him, was unbearable. "I'll talk to him, Barbara. I'll make him understand that he needs to start pulling his weight or find somewhere else to stay," Jimmy finally said, though his voice lacked conviction. The next morning, Jimmy sat down with Brent and laid out the situation. He explained that they loved him and wanted to help, but things couldn't continue as they were. Brent needed to get serious about finding a job and taking responsibility for his life, or he would have to find another place to stay. Brent reacted predictably, with anger and defiance. He accused Jimmy of abandoning him, of choosing Barbara over his own brother. But Jimmy stood firm, though it pained him to do so. He loved Brent, but he couldn't let his brother's issues destroy his marriage. Over the next week, Brent made some half-hearted attempts to find work, but it was clear his heart wasn't in it. Finally, one evening he announced that he was leaving. He had found a friend's couch to crash on, and he didn't need their help anymore. The words were bitter, but there was a hint of relief in them too. As Brent packed his things, Barbara felt a mix of emotions. She was relieved that their home would be peaceful again, but she also felt a pang of guilt. She didn't want to be the reason the brothers were estranged. But she knew it was the right thing to do for all of them. After Brent left, the tension in the house began to lift. Barbara and Jimmy started to rebuild their relationship, focusing on each other and their marriage. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when the shadow of what had happened loomed over them. But they were determined to move forward together. As for Brent, he eventually found a job and started to get his life back on track. The brothers' relationship remained strained for a while, but over time they began to heal. They would never go back to the way things were, but perhaps that was for the best. They had both learned that sometimes, the hardest thing you can do for someone you love is to let them go. In the end, Barbara knew that love wasn't just about sacrifice, it was about setting boundaries, about knowing when to say no, even when to say no, even when it hurt. And she was grateful that she and Jimmy had found their way back to each other, stronger and more united than ever before.